welcome to everyone who is here. I am going to be sending out invitations to panelists. This will give you the option of turning on your camera, of asking questions more directly, of raising your hand with a physical through the icon. But you can always ask questions in chat. I will happily relay them to Rabbi Silber. If you have your own copy of the Mishnayos on Nazir, please keep them at hand. Otherwise, I will share sources on the screen. And as always, this class, Interpreting the Nazir, our fifth of 6 sessions, is offered in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. With that, Rabbi Silber?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so what we discussed last week, just to pick it up for a moment, the last thing we focused on last week was the Mishnah in Nazir, chapter 6, Mishnah number 5. The Mishnah there begins this way, Shlosha minim asurim b'Nazir. So the Mishnah says there are 3 kinds of prohibitions that are relevant to the Nazir. That phrase, Shlosha minim asurim b'Nazir, is in the beginning of Mishnah number 5, but actually is in the beginning of the chapter. The Mishnah repeats that phrase, so apparently it's very important. And just to understand what the Mishnah is saying, the Mishnah is saying that the Mishnah is looking at the Nazir in terms of prohibitions. There are 3 prohibitions: cutting hair, coming into contact with the dead, and drinking wine or eating grapes or grape products. Those are the prohibitions. And what the Mishnah then does in chapter 6, Mishnah number 5, is it talks about the relative strength of, or seriousness, severity of these prohibitions. It's not, the Mishnah doesn't often do this, but it sometimes does it. It says that on one hand, drinking of wine seems the least severe of the 3. Because the drinking of wine during the Nazirite vow does not invalidate the vow. The vow still stands. You have violated something. It's a prohibition, forbidden to do it. It's a mitzvah lo taseh, but the vow still stands. That's not true, says the Mishnah, if you cut your hair or you come into contact with the dead. That in that case, in some sense, the vow is actually broken. In the case of coming in contact with the dead, the vow is completely, you have to start over again. There's a process called of bringing sacrifices, cutting hair again, and then you start over again. And even in terms of haircuts, cutting hair, at the end of the Mishnah distinguishes between coming into contact with the dead, tumah, and the hair cutting. Because the hair cutting, says the Mishnah, you have to start again, but only for 30 days. You're not really undoing the vow. The vow stands, but because you need a certain hair growth to complete the Nazirite vow, and the Mishnah presumes it's a growth of 30 days, so you would have to have another 30 days. So if you were 10 days before the end of the vow, you'd have to have 30 days, and you would go 20 days more than you had expected. So that's on one hand. And then the Mishnah says, on the other hand, the drinking of the wine or grape products or whatever, that's not a prohibition that can ever be lifted. We're not talking about, medical emergencies, life-threatening situations. That's a general rule. That, of course, almost nothing overturns that. But within the cutting of hair and the prohibition of coming into contact with the dead, there's a leniency in each one of those 2. The leniency of cutting hair is if the person happens to be a mitzvah, who for the purification process has to cut the hair, then you are permitted to cut hair. And when it comes to coming into contact with the dead, then we have a different leniency. That if the Nazir comes into contact with a corpse that is lying in an open area, and there's no one to bury the corpse, which is known in the Mishnah as a mitzvah, then that takes precedence over the vow of the Nazir, and the Nazir would have to bury the person, and then would have to start the Nazirut all over again. So that's what the Mishnah says in chapter 6, Mishnah number 5. But what the Mishnah is really dealing with, I think, is the question which emerges from anybody who just reads the parsha of the Nazir and the stories of the Nazir. That is, there are three prohibitions. Which of these three is really the most significant? Can we say that one of these three prohibitions is core to the Nazir? Is it coming into contact with the dead? Is it the hair? Or is it the wine? It's a very good question when you're studying the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, of course, is our entry point into the whole tradition, the oral tradition, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Mishnah is the key entry point. That's why it's important really to study Mishnah. You really do get a sense. Of course, the Gemara picks up and runs with the Mishnah, but you get a sense from the Mishnah about what Torah Sheba'al Peh encompasses. And I'll get more back to that later. But I think when you read the stories of the Bible, Shimshon, for example, in the case of Shimshon, it's pretty clear that it's all about his hair, that his strength is emerging from the fact that he doesn't cut his hair, that when his hair is cut, he lost his strength. Something about the hair, which is pretty central in the Shimshon story. On the other hand, when you read the Chumash, which is chapter 6 of Bamidbar, it is true that the only thing that actually undoes the vow is coming into contact with the dead. So what the Mishnah really is doing, and we study the Mishnah is, of course, looking at it from the standpoint of rules and laws. There is some agadic material in the Mishnah, but largely speaking, it's rules and laws. But we look at these rules and laws, if we look just a little deeper, then we can see what the Mishnah really is actually struggling with. What the Mishnah is putting out there and saying there are these three prohibitions, but each one seems to have a stringency and a leniency that the other one doesn't have. So that's the Mishnah we saw last week. Shosha meaning Asurin Banazir. What I wanted to look at now is the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in chapter 7, because this has come up a couple of different times through comments and questions. When you look at the Chumash, and the Chumash speaks about the Nazir, so the Torah has we have these three prohibitions that we just discussed. We have not drinking wine, we have the cutting hair business, not cutting one's hair, and then there's this business of not coming into contact with the dead. Now, not coming in contact with the dead, in the words of the Torah says, the case of the Torah is in Nazir, chapter 6 of Sefer Bamidbar, a parsha we're coming to pretty soon, actually. If someone died suddenly, the person suddenly is confronted with the fact that there's a corpse in front of the Nazir. Then it says that the person has to go through this process of purification, or rather completion of the vow, however we understand it, brings 3 sacrifices, cuts hair, and starts all over again. So that's that's one thing. And the Torah also says that this Nazir is not permitted to come into contact with any dead person, including, says the Torah, members of the Nazir's own family. Mother, father, brother, sister, not permitted to come into contact with any dead whatsoever. Now that, when you read the Chumash, of course, when you read the Chumash, you say to yourself, where have we encountered this, where a person is not permitted to come into contact with any dead at all? Because remember, coming into contact with dead means essentially in the obligation to bury one's relatives is on the relative. It means you can't go to your parents' funeral. Where do we find such a thing? So in the Chumash, which of course is what the Mishnah is going to pick up immediately, the Chumash does have a group of people who are forbidden to come into contact with the dead, and they are the priests, like the Kohanim, are not permitted to come into contact with the dead. But the Chumash in Parshat Emor, that we read not long ago, distinguishes between 2 kinds of Kohanim. A regular Kohen, it's called a Kohen Hedyot, is not permitted to come into contact with the dead, but is permitted to come into contact with the closest relatives. When the Gemara speaks of it, talks about the Shiva Krovim, the 7 closest relatives. How you get to 7 is a good question, but in any event, for our purposes, not our topic. But essentially for close family, for immediate family, the Kohen is permitted to come into contact with the dead, and the Gemara thinks not just permitted, but actually obligated. You're obligated, not just permitted. So that's as far as the Kohen is concerned. But there's one exception to the rule, and that is the Kohen Gadol. The high priest may not come into contact with even the closest relatives. You have the story in the Torah, one of the 2 narratives in the book of Vayikra, the death of Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, and Moshe says, the show must go on, Aaron, you got to keep working. You're not permitted to get involved with this. So when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, this one singular solitary person, the high priest, the Torah is explicit, even for the closest relatives, the Kohen Gadol is not permitted to come into contact with the dead. So therefore, when you read the parasha of the Nazir, and the Torah says that the Nazir may not come into contact even with the closest relatives of the Nazir, so what that suggests to the reader, I think, before you get to the Mishnah, is that there's some kind of connection here between the Nazir on one hand and the high priest on the other. It certainly is connected in terms of the prohibition of coming into contact with the dead. And one could, I think, even extend that when you were studying the Torah to make the argument that perhaps even the other 2 prohibitions, namely the not drinking wine, grape products on one hand, and not cutting hair on the other, has some literary link to the Kohen Gadol. In the case of the Kohen Gadol, the Torah says the Kohen Gadol is forbidden, so the other Kohen forbidden. When they enter into the Ol Moed, which either could mean to bring the sacrifice, or maybe perhaps even the entry itself is forbidden if the Kohen is intoxicated. That's one thing. And the second thing is the Torah says that after the death of Nadav and Avihu, don't let your hair grow wild and don't tear your clothing. Now, the precise prohibition is referring dafka to not to mourn, doesn't mean in general. So the Gemara assumes that the Kohen is not allowed to do any kind of avoda with torn garments. But it also sounds like the Kohen is not permitted to have long hair. So here we have something very interesting, that the Nazir, in thinking of the Nazir and the prohibitions of the Nazir, which are 3, the grape products, wine, on one hand, the hair, not cutting hair, and then, of course, not coming into contact with the dead. These 3 prohibitions are all found in one form or another in terms of the Kohen, and especially the Kohen Gadol. They're not identical, but certainly the fact that these 3 appear in both suggests to us that what the Nazir seems to be about, among other things, is somebody who says, she or he says, in effect, I want to be the high priest. I want to have the same status as the high priest. But the Torah says you can do it on a temporary basis. But for that time, the Torah permits someone, whoever it may be, to assume the status of the Kohen Gadol. That's what it does. When you read the Chumash, that's certainly, the Chumash suggests this. And what really suggests it is this prohibition, not coming into contact, even with the closest relatives. Even the Kohen, regular Kohen, is permitted to do so, but not the Kohen Gadol. So it's this thinking that I think is what the Mishnah, without saying this, is what the Mishnah sort of assumes, and we'll see this in one moment in Mishnah chapter 7, Mishnah number 1, that the Mishnah assumes that one has made this connection and then raises a kind of hypothetical question about the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol. Let me just say one point before we start reading Mishnah in chapter 7, Mishnah 1, and that is that there's one basic difference between the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol. The Mishnah will have other differences, but one difference is the following. When you're studying the Chumash, this comes up, of course, that the Kohen Gadol didn't declare himself a Kohen Gadol. We don't know exactly how it works. Is it hereditary? Is he chosen by the other priests? But when the Torah speaks of the Kohen Gadol, HaKohen HaGadol Me'achav, Asher Yimshach Al Rosho Shemen HaMishcha. It's the high priest upon whose head was poured the anointing oil. That's the language of the Torah when it comes to the Kohen Gadol. So it speaks of the head of the Kohen Gadol. The oil has been poured upon his head. When it comes to the Nazir, however, whose head is also mentioned very explicitly, right? Rosh Nizro. The Torah does speak about the head of the Nazir, which suggests that the hair, the not cutting hair, is very central. Again, I raised this question before. But who declared the head of the Nazir to be holy? Kadosh. Who declared the Nazir to be Kadosh? Answer, the Nazir himself or herself declared the Nazir to be Kadosh. Therein lies a critical difference between the two. The Kohen Gadol is appointed by somebody else. The Nazir is self-appointed, which is one of the reasons that the Talmud, the Gemara, raises all kinds of questions explicitly about the Nazir. Is it a good thing to be a Nazir? Is Nazir problematic? Because after all, you have somebody saying about themselves, I'm equivalent to the high priest. Does that strike us as being somewhat vain, hubris? And of course, the Talmud has discussions about this. Now, the Mishnah doesn't talk in those terms, but the Mishnah, which is the gateway to Torah Shebaal Peh, does in effect presume this parallel, and it discusses it in a different way in chapter 7, Mishnah number 1, which we're going to read now. Before I start chapter 7, Mishnah 1, is there anybody who wants to comment about anything that's been said so far? Again, the parallel between the two is Kadosh. The Nazir is called Kadosh, and the Kohen is Kadosh. The Kohen is holy. And we have a mitzvah, actually, the Kiddush Tov, the Torah says, you shall sanctify the priest. It's actually a halacha. The question is how it applies nowadays to give the Kohen the first aliyah, to lead the benching. And nowadays there's much less significance. But the Kiddush Tov, the Torah says, the Kiddush Tov, you, the people, should sanctify the priest who does God's work. Nowadays the Kohen isn't doing God's work. But so there is this idea of Kedusha, which is relevant both to the Kohen Gadol and to the Nazir. And we suggested last time, which is why Tumah actually undoes it. Tumah and Kedusha are opposites. Those are opposites. So the Tameh is not Kadosh. The Kadosh is not Tameh. Okay, before we start Mishnah chapter 7, Mishnah 1, does anybody have any comment or question?
And feel welcome to ask in chat as well.
Okay, if not, we'll just jump into chapter 7. Chapter 7, Mishnah 1. The Tractate Nazir has 9 chapters. So we have this week and next week, we're going to touch upon 3 or 4 interesting mishnaic, I think, that are suggestive about how the Mishnah works, which is one of the interests that we have here. So the Mishnah says this, chapter 7, Mishnah 1, Kohen Gadol v'Nazir einon mitamin b'krovein. So the Torah says the Kohen Gadol, the Mishnah says this straight up, chapter 7, Mishnah 1. Kohen Gadol and Nazir are not permitted to be mitameh, to make themselves ritually impure, even in regard to their closest relatives. Those are the 2 exceptions to the general rule. Generally speaking, everybody, including the Kohen, may or perhaps must be mitameh to the closest relatives. By the way, let me just say one parenthetical point, and that is, when the Rambam talks about, the Rambam codifies everything. He has a whole section called Hilchot Avelut, the laws of mourning. And right away, the Rambam connects the rules of mourning with the idea that the Kohen comes into contact with the dead relatives. For the Rambam, those 2 things are actually related. So here we have it already in the Mishnah. Kohen Gadol v'Nazir ein matamin b'krovei. That's the exception. They are not matamin even to their closest relatives. Avo matamin l'meit mitzvah. We had this, remember, back in chapter 6. We just read it. But there's an exception to the rule. They are metame, which means they're obligated to be metame to a mate mitzvah. A mate mitzvah, again, we're talking about a corpse. See a body on the road, and there's no one to bury it. We don't know who the relatives are. Maybe the relatives don't know. Maybe there are no relatives, whatever. So what do? So then the halacha is, says the Mishnah, that whoever chances upon this corpse must bury this person, even the high priest and the Nazir. That's the halacha of mate mitzvah. That was an exception to the general rule. That was that when it comes to tumah, there's an exception to the rule. And the exception is mate mitzvah. Whether that means that the rule was that the Torah never formulated the prohibition in terms of mate mitzvah, or whether it means that it does, but mate mitzvah overrides it. That's a question that appears in the Talmud in several contexts. It's a very important question, actually. In the Talmud picks up these mishnaic and runs with them in all directions. But the discussion in the Talmud whether certain things are hutra or dechuya. That is to say, the prohibition is there, but something else overrides it. Or do you say, no, there was never a prohibition in the first place? But either way you read it, at the end of the day, it is, for our purposes, hutra is permissible and even obligatory for the high priest or the Nazir to bury this person. Fine. Now the Mishnah gives us a case. The chances of this case happening are probably not great. That doesn't matter. Codes don't deal with cases necessarily that happen often. Quite the opposite. The codes deal with liminal cases because they want to bring out a concept. So now the Mishnah has the following case. Hayu mahalchim ba'derech. It just so happens that a Nazir and a Kohen Gadol are walking together on the road. Not that likely that the Kohen Gadol and a Nazir are working together. Anyway, that's the case in the Mishnah. Umatzu mate mitzvah. And what do you know? They're walking on the road, and there's a mate mitzvah on the road. So what do you do in this case? So here we have a dispute in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yitama Kohen Gadol v'Yitama Nazir. So which one of these two fellows should be mitame? Should be mitame? Rabbi Eliezer says the high priest should do it. V'Yitame Nazir. V'Chachamim omrim Yitame Nazir v'Yitama Kohen Gadol. And the Chachamim say no. It's better that the Nazir bury the mate mitzvah, but not the high priest. By the way, this dispute of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim does suggest to me, in any event, that the Mishnah is presuming that fundamentally the prohibition does exist, even for a mate mitzvah. Something overrides it, and once something overrides it, then the question is, we should override in the case which is least severe of the two, the least severe of the prohibitions, the prohibition of the Kohen Gadol and the prohibition of the Nazir. Because if it's just permitted to do a mate mitzvah, I would have said either one could do it. There's no prohibition; it's a mate mitzvah. One could disagree with that, but it doesn't matter. But that's the question. Now, Rabbi Eliezer here is Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, the famous Rabbi Eliezer, who appears in many mishnayot. He's the one who is the subject of the famous story of Tanur Shachnai. Generally speaking, we don't follow his opinion. Generally speaking, with exceptions, we don't follow his opinion, but sometimes we do. He was a great scholar. He was one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva. He appears often in the Mishnah and is perceived to be a tremendous scholar. The Chachami means is a general statement, it means the majority view. So we have this dispute, fine. Which one of them should bury the mate mitzvah? And now the Mishnah continues and tells us the argument between what the argument was of each of the two. Amar lahem Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer said to the Chachamim, Yitama Kohen, Sheino Mevi Korban al Tumato. Yaw Yitama Nazir, Shehu Mevi Korban al Tumato. So Rabbi Eliezer says, listen, the prohibition of the Nazir is more severe. Because in the Torah, it says that if the Nazir comes into contact with the dead, not only does the Nazir have to start all over again, Hayamim Harishonim Yiplu, but there's a process through which the Nazir can restart the Nazirut, and that involves bringing three sacrifices. Brings three sacrifices. It brings a Karban Chatat, a Karban Asham, and a Karban Olah. So there's three sacrifices. So it says Rabbi Eliezer, you see the severity of the Nazir coming into contact with the mate, that he brings karbanot, he brings sacrifices. That's not true of a high priest. So therefore, obviously, the Torah considers that the Nazir coming into contact with the dead to be something so serious, so severe. It doesn't simply say you start over again. You have to bring karbanot, three of them, no less. So therefore, you see that the status of the Nazir vis-a-vis Tumah is more severe than that of the Kohen Gadol. So therefore, it's better that the Kohen Gadol bury this mate mitzvah and not the Nazir. That's his opinion. Amrulo. But the Chachamim said no. Yitama Nazir. It's better that the Nazir be matame. Why? Shein kedushato kedushat olam. V'yaw yitama kohen shekadushato kedushat olam. So the Chachamim say, and that's the majority view. Generally, we follow the view of the Chachamim. They distinguish in the other direction. They say a Nazir's prohibition is temporary. It's only temporary. That's what the whole Seder Mishnayot of Masechet Nazir is pushing that point. Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. The default is it is temporary. V'yayi Tama Kohen. So it's better that the Nazir, because the Nazir's kedusha is of a lesser status. It's less significant. The Kohen Gadol is a permanent situation. That which is permanent, I would say even beyond this, I would formulate it this way. Permanence and kedusha go hand in hand. That which is kadosh is permanently kadosh. So they're saying, listen, the two things are not comparable. The kedusha of the Nazir is only temporary. Ein elo kedushat olam. The Kohen is kedushato kedushat olam. Now, what's interesting is, in this regard, I'll stop in a minute and take comments or questions, but we know from the very beginning of Tractate Nazir that there are two kinds of Nazirim. One of the first mishnaic that we studied. There is a Nazir who's temporary, but there's also something called the Nazir Olam. Remember, someone says, I want to be a Nazir my whole life. So the Mishnah said that that person is a Nazir Olam, and the prohibitions apply during one's entire lifetime, except that this Nazir Olam is permitted to make kel batar. He's allowed to lighten up his head, to cut some hair periodically. The dispute in the Talmud, what does periodically mean? Maybe it's once a year. The model is Avshalom. We'll go back to Avshalom next week as a model of Nazir. So the question is, would the Chachamim say this if we were talking about not a regular Nazir, but a Nazir Olam? Someone who said, I want to be a Nazir my entire life, which from the biblical text, not from beyond the book of Bamidbar, does seem to be that a Nazir is a Nazir permanently. It's like the prophet. You're a prophet, you're a Nazir. So that's the question, actually. Would a Nazir Olam be in the same category according to the Chachamim? And that question actually is an interesting question, because it depends how you understand Nazir Olam. Is Nazir Olam really one Nazirut for one's lifetime? Or on the other hand, the very fact that you can get a haircut every so often suggests that even a Nazir Olam is, for the most part, a kind of consecutive set of Nazirut, something along those lines. So that's kind of a detailed question. But over here, what's interesting for our purposes here is what the Mishnah assumes. The Mishnah assumes that the Kohen Gadol and the Nazir are basically of one piece. And as I mentioned earlier, with the one piece, sort of what combines the two, is the fact that the Torah calls the Nazir Kadosh. The Nazir is Kadosh Hashem. He is not permitted to cut his hair. He's not permitted to drink wine, this and that. But the Torah also said Kadosh Yeh Gadel Perasar Rosho. And when it comes to the hair, we remember that in the book of Bamidbar, in the chapter 6, it also puts it one time in positive terms. The Nazir is Kadosh, he must let the hair grow. As I mentioned, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, the Nazir is both, looking from a standpoint of a code. The laws of Nazir, not to drink wine, not to come in contact. That's what we call mitzvah lo taseh. But on top of that, there's also mitzvah aseh. And the mitzvah aseh revolves around the hair, which does suggest that the hair is central. Kadosh yeh, and the Torah called the Nazir Kadosh. You remember, of course, and I'll stop in a minute and take comments or questions, the famous Ramban in the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim. The Torah says, Kedoshim to you. Moshe gathers all the people, and God's instruction tells them, commands them, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy. And the famous Ramban said, against Rashi, that Kedoshim to you is a general statement. It means apart from all the mitzvot that I have taught you and will teach you, Kedoshim, there's another mitzvah, to be a holy person. So the Ramban says, you can keep the whole Torah, technically speaking, and not be a good person. So the Torah says, beyond this, Kedoshim to you. Famous Ramban. Then the Ramban says, where do we have such a model? Where is a model of somebody who was Kadosh? Says the Ramban, that's chapter 6 of Bamidbar. That's the Nazir. The Torah said, Kadosh, the Nazir is holy. So the Ramban then asked the question, if the Nazir is holy, so why at the end of the Nazirut vow, the Nazir brings 3 sacrifices at the end, having successfully completed the vow, the Nazir brings 3 sacrifices, one of which is a sin offering. And the Ramban assumes, which is questionable, that the sin offering has something to do with a sin, with something that's wrong. But if he's holy, why should he bring a sin offering when the Nazir completes the vow? Says the Ramban, he brings a sin offering for stopping. Not because he did something wrong, the opposite. If you declare yourself a Nazir and you successfully completed it, what are you stopping for? Be Kadosh forever. So that's the Ramban, the famous Ramban of Kadoshim Tiyu. And that's the Mishnah over here, which presumes straight out that the Kohen Gadol and the Nazir have much in common. The only question is, again, the severity of the Kedusha, the fact that one is only temporary, which the Mishnah emphasizes very much, suggests that the Kedusha is of a lesser order, because Kedusha and permanence always go together. Okay, let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions, then we'll jump to another very interesting Mishnah in the 9th chapter of Masechet Nazir.
All right, any questions? You can ask in person, you can ask in chat. If you're a panelist, I can let you speak.
The Nazir is not prohibited on Sheikhar. So presumably the Nazir could drink something intoxicating. The Kohen can drink something intoxicating when he's not doing the service, but is not prohibited completely.
Well, the Torah does mention Sheikhar with the Nazir as well. The point is that the rabbinic understanding of Sheikhar, the Torah says Nazir can't have Sheikhar, but the rabbinic understanding of Sheikhar in both instances is not whiskey. It's some kind of wine, old wine, new wine. That's the rabbinic understanding of it. The plain meaning of Sheikhar was that which is, again, there's a discussion about the Kohen doing avoda if the Kohen is actually intoxicated, even from not from having wine. And by the way, there's an ancillary prohibition when the Torah speaks of the Kohen not drinking wine and doing avoda. In the next verse, in the chapter 10 of Vayikra, is Ul Holot et Bnei Yisrael, because the Kohen is also a teacher. Kohen is to teach Israel certain rules, Tumah and Tara, etc., etc. And from this, the Talmud derives that a teacher, someone who's replying to questions, is not permitted to drink either. One is not permitted to shikar al yoreh, shasli al yoreh. If you've drunk, you're not permitted to actually to paskin shilos, as it were. And there's a whole discussion in the Rishonim about the severity of that prohibition. But in terms of the quick answer to your point or response, it's the Torah does say sheikhar in both of them. Actually, it's just the rabbinic understanding of sheikhar is not as we understand sheikhar, which is whiskey or schnapps or whatever you call it, but rather some form of wine. But the idea is clear. The idea is that this is, what is the idea of not drinking wine? Since you raised the question. And you can read it in different ways, but the Nazir, you could say that being intoxicated and being kadosh are somehow mutually exclusive. Losing control of one's faculties is the meaning of one's sacred status. That's certainly one possibility. The other possibility, which doesn't contradict the first, is that wine is actually a social drink. The Nazir, not that he's antisocial, he's sort of asocial. The Nazir is one who's separate. It means separate. The Nazir separates, and separation, this extreme separation, is relevant to the way the long hair, because the long hair means you are setting yourself apart, like the hippies or the Beatles. You set yourself apart. The part of the body you actually can easily control is the hair. The drinking wine is a social drink, and of course, not coming into contact with any dead means never go to funerals. So the Nazir, then, one can see these three prohibitions of the Nazir in terms of social distancing of a kind of extreme order. Because one serves God, and the Torah seems to suggest, Moshe says to Aaron, your job is to serve God. And you may serve humanity as well, but not when it comes into conflict with the service of God. But the Nazir is certainly, since the very word Nazir means the one who is separate, it's one of its meanings, separation. So maybe the non-drinking of wine has to do with a social context of being socially separate. Okay, anybody else for a comment or question here?
This is a
Yes.
general question.
Go
I
ahead.
know that the Levium, when they started out, they were shaved of all their body hair,
That's true.
right? But was that a one-time thing? After that, they could have their hair for the rest of their lives? They were
Right.
normal looking?
Sounds like a one-time thing.
Okay.
There's three situations in the Torah of shaving one's hair, one's body.
The
The
Mitzorah,
Mitzorah, the Levi, and then we have the Nazir who shaves his head, not his whole body. But those two, the Levium was a one-time deal when they were first inaugurated,
right?
which suggests to us something about this idea of cutting one's hair. That the Nazir cuts the hair, on cutting or not cutting one's hair, has to do with some kind of separate status. That the Nazir is becoming a Nazir is one status. At the end of it, the Nazir's hair is cut to suggest a kind of return back to society. The Kohen Gadol, on the other hand, which the Torah says should not have long hair, and the Gemara discusses how often the Kohen Gadol gets a haircut. And I think the consensus is once a week. And the idea of always having your hair trimmed and stuff like that speaks to what I said just now, which is about a social being. The Kohen Gadol represents the Jewish people. He's like the flag. He represents the Jewish people. So he has to not stand out in that way. He stands out in other ways, but not the way he dresses, etc. I once suggested that, just a short point, that when you read the story of the golden calf, what's in the book of Shemot, not in the book of Devarim, which is different, but in the book of Shemot, what's curious is that God is very angry, threatens to kill all the people. There's a civil war, thousands die. But strangely, Aaron HaKohen doesn't ever seem to be in any kind of jeopardy, even though he made the golden calf. So I suggested once that because when God said to Moshe on the mountain, okay, I'm not going to destroy the people. Once God says, I'm not going to destroy the people, you don't destroy Aaron, because Aaron is the people. Aaron was chosen because he's one of the people. That was why he was chosen in the first place. So he's like the flag. He represents the Jewish people. So those are the three cases, the Levium, the Mitzorah, and the Nazir. Those are the three. Okay, anybody else? So let's begin now with these are this week and next week, which is the last session. We're going to look at some mishnayot in the last chapter of Masechet Nazir. And the reason I chose to do this is because there's actually a different point I wanted to make about study of Mishnah. All of these sessions are in, my goal here is a simple goal to get everybody to start learning Mishnah. I think that it is the gateway to Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this is coming from somebody who spent most of their life teaching Torah Shebechtav, teaching Torah, Tanakh, etc. But you know, the Mishnah is the gateway. So, it's much more accessible than say Daf Yomi. You still it's not always simple, but it's much more accessible. So one of the questions in the study of Mishnah is the kind of order of the Mishnah, and that's really two different questions, which is one of the basic questions of Mishnah. First of all, the Mishnayot themselves seem to be, the Tractate itself often seems to be in a very strange order. You see this strikingly when you open up the Rambam, who wrote the great code called the Mishnah Torah, called it the Mishnah Torah. And he writes about all the 6 Sidrei Mishnah are in the Rambam, unlike other codes. They only have 4 of the 6. Don't talk about ritual purity, don't talk about sacrifices. The Rambam's got everything. But the Rambam is the most ordered person who ever existed. So he sets it up in such a way that it always makes complete sense in terms of the order. When you look at the Mishnayot, it strikes us very often that many of the Mishnayot are in the strangest order. In fact, today or yesterday, we started, those doing Daf Yomi, they're doing Masechet Gitin. And Masechet Gitin, the order of the Mishnah in Masechet Gitin is bizarre beyond belief. Actually, if you start with the last chapter and read backwards, it's in perfect order. The last chapter of Gittin talks about what is a get. What actually is a get? That's chapter 9 of Gittin. The first chapter starts someone who brings a get from Chutz La'aretz. What's a get? What? So when you read the Mishnah of Gittin, it's actually backwards. And what is that all about? That's a very important question. That's one question about the Mishnah, about the Seder HaMishnah. And there's another question about the Seder of the Mishnah, which is, what is the relationship between one tractate and the next? So I just want to say now that the way it's ordered here, yes, it is, as many have discovered, it's basically in size order. But it's not just in size order. That's very important. People who learn Mishnah their whole lives don't know this. The Mishnah is written in size order. Size order. That's why, for example, in the Seder Nashim, the last tractate is Kedushin. Gittin is before Kedushin. Because Gittin is 9 chapters and Kedushin is 4. They're actually in size order. Yevamot is biggest, Ketuvah is second, that's the order. So, but there is also an order. Now over here, it was set up this way, but it could be fewer chapters. So you have the three Sidarim, one after the next. There is Nadarim, followed by Nazir, followed by Sota. And when you open up the Chumash, we have that those 3 are seen as one. And in terms of the idea of the 3 is Nadarim, Nazir, and Sota. That Nazir is connected to Nadarim. Obviously, Nazir is a neder. That's one of the main points of this tractate. Something you take on voluntarily for a limited amount of time. But it also is followed by tractate Sota. Now, in the Chumash, what's interesting is in the Chumash, Sota is Bamidbar chapter 5, and Nazir is chapter 6. 2 long chapters. In the Mishnah, Nazir comes just before Sota. But leaving the question out of the particular order, which came first and second, but you see something in the Mishnah that actually there is a suggestion, a strong one, that the Mishnayot of Nazir have Sota in mind. And we'll see this, we'll begin with it now, and we'll see it more next week. And then the last Mishnah of Masechet Nazir, which I want to deal with, suddenly there's a third personality who's a Nazir, which is Shmuel Hanavi. So that's the plan for now and next week. So let's begin now with chapter 9, Mishnah number 2. Here we have a very strange halacha, which I would imagine is not known to that many people. It's not one of those things that is central to our thinking, but this is actually a very interesting Mishnah. So let's begin it now. Not a simple Mishnah. The Mishnah says the following: Nazir shegilach v'nodalo shehu tameh. You have the following case: somebody took a vow to be a Nazir, and then completed the vow. 30-day vow. Stam Nazirite shloshim yom, 30 days. It's over. Gilach means not always. Nazir means not just to shave, but to shaving with the sacrifices. Completed it, brought the sacrifices, cut hair, and then discovers after everything's done, someone says to this person, you know, that place you went to, and you were walking over there, there were dead bodies over there. There were dead bodies over there. Im tuma yudua soter. If the tuma, right, if it was known, in other words, if people were aware of the fact that there was tuma there when he went there, then soter, then he has to start all over again. And the Nazir starts all over again. V'im tumata tahom eino soter. But if the tumah at the time that the person, that the Nazir was in contact with the dead, and we discover after the Nazir is completed that it wasn't known at the time. It was too much she'ena yedua. Now people, they did an archaeological dig, and they found some corpses. But at the time, no one knew. But it turns out now that the Nazir was in fact tamei mate at the time of the Nazirut. Says the Mishnah, eino soter. Tumat tahom eino soter. They call it tumat tahom, but the tumah of the deep, things that are buried underground, the deep below, right? Tahom, choshech b'nei tahom. Right. Imat shelo gilach, vein kach uvein kach soter. But if the Nazir was told this before having completed the vow, literally shaving, the sacrifices and shaving, then the Nazir starts all over again. And the Mishnah gives an example of what is Yedua and any Yedua. So let's just read the example. Ketzad. Yorad litbo b'amara, v'nimtza meitzaf al pi amara tamei. Person went down, litbo doesn't mean, person went down for a swim. It doesn't mean to be total for any specific purpose. Went to a cave to cool in the cave. It's a hot day. So the Nazir goes into the cave, takes a swim, and they find a body floating in terms of the water in the cave. See a body floating, tamei. Then the Nazir is tamei because we presume, since the body was on top of the water, we presume that somebody must have known about it. Tumah yudua, to somebody. It's not clear to whom, but someone knew about the tumah. In which case, the Nazir has to start all over again. However, nimsa mishuka bakarka hamara. But if the body was found somehow deep, buried inside the bottom of the cave, yorad lo haker, and the person went down to cool off, tahar. So this is the first part of the Mishnah. Now what is the basis for this rule? From a logical standpoint, obviously, it doesn't seem to make any sense. What's the difference? If in fact it turns out that we now know that the person was in contact with the corpse during the time of the vow, then this should undo you have to start all over again. So the Gemara says, true, it's not, logically speaking, there is no source for this, but it's what the Gemara calls halacha. So the Mishnah doesn't say halacha, but the Gemara understands the Mishnah to mean halacha. And what that means, halacha means, sometimes it's called halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So halachot are things that don't, this is the Gemara's understanding, things that generally speaking don't have a scriptural basis, but they are traditions which we presume to come from Sinai. So they have the status of a Torah law, but there's no Torah text. What differences exist, if any, between laws that are derived from the text or laws that are derived from pure tradition is an interesting question. But the consensus seems to be that generally speaking, we assume that those things has a status of a kind of Torah law. It's a kind of unwritten Torah law that is known in the jargon is, this is halacha. That's the term halacha that's found in the Gemara often. So here's what's interesting is the following. So the Mishnah, let's just read one more line in the Mishnah. Yorad lo haker tahar. V'taher mi tumat meit tamei. Shecheskat tamei tamei. V'cheskat tahar tahar. Sheraglayim ladavar. So let's read the English over here. Scroll down a little bit. All right. Let's stop. Right. So it says the following. If a person was tamei and enters water to what is kind of mikvah or mayan, so the water is going to matar you. It's like a mikvah, right? So the person was already tamei, and then it went down to purify from a corpse. So he's and it's a question: is this going to be able to? It's a question: the status of was the corpse there, not there? So we presume that the status of the person remains, right? In other words, something that has a presumptive status of impurity remains impure. Something that has the presumptive status of purity is pure. It is reasonable that items of people retain their presumptive status. The language of the Mishnah over here, this is a very important question. We'll see there's another Mishnah that makes the same point. The language of the Mishnah is Sheraglayim ladavar. The last two words of the Mishnah, Raglayim ladavar, literally the thing has feet. It means this is the kind of assumption that we make. The term Raglayim ladavar appears in Mishnah, and as we'll see next week, it appears in Mishnah later on, Mishnah 4. It appears several times in Mishnah number 4. Now, let me just say a couple of words about this Raglayim ladavar business. For those who have studied a fair amount of Gemara, the expression Raglayim ladavar is most prominently associated with the rule of the Sota. That's where it comes up. The expression Raglayim ladavar comes up with the Sota. Sota is the next tractate. This is the last chapter of Tractate Nazir. Because the story of the Sota is the following. The Sota is a situation which someone has a status which is unknown. The case is the way that, again, we're not learning Sota now. Sota is fascinating. What the Mishnah does with what it says in the Chumash, how it deviates from the Chumash, how it reinterprets the Chumash. It's a good study, but not for now. But just briefly. So in the Chumash, so the husband is, you have a jealous husband. The way the Mishnah understands it is he warned his wife in front of witnesses, I don't want you hanging out with Mr. X. So according to the Gemara, he needs witnesses. It must be a formal proceeding. The Torah doesn't seem to say that, but that's what the Mishnah assumes. And then she, in fact, was seen with Mr. X. What happened there, nobody knows. We don't know, but she was with him together in a private place. So then, under those circumstances, he brings her to the temple, and there's this whole ordeal of the Sota. The Gemara talks about, now the question is how many witnesses do you need? This is a dispute. Let's say 2 witnesses also saw her in private with this same fellow. But they don't know what happened there. They were just in private. What about if one witness says they were sleeping together? One witness. So generally speaking, one witness is not sufficient. When it comes to monetary matters of personal status, that is marriage, divorce, these kinds of things, al pishnayim eidim yakum davar. But there are exceptions. One of the exceptions is when one witness says they were actually sleeping together. And why do we believe one witness? So the language of the Gemara is raglayim ladavar, because it's probable, because the probable cause, because she was already warned. There's already a question about this fellow, and there were witnesses. They were together, etc. So in other words, the question of the Sota actually, which the Mishnah is very interested in, and I would say interested in general. I mean, I would say one of the one of the interests of Mishnah in general. And we'll see this next week, that the Mishnah brings together different areas of halakha, compares different areas, sees it as a system. And the Gemara picks this up and runs with it. So the point is, one of the questions in the Mishnah, in many different contexts, is what do you do when you don't have evidence? We don't have witnesses. You don't have evidence. Most cases don't have evidence. People have a dispute. One says this, one says that. He says this, she says that. How do you adjudicate disputes when there is very little evidence? And in the case of Sota, of course, that is exactly the case of the Sota. We don't know what happened. So the question is trying to figure out, what do we assume? Do we assume innocent to proven guilty? Do we assume in the case of Sota, guilty to proven innocent? Because there's all kinds of circumstantial evidence. Because there's kind of reasonable assumption one can make. That's called Raglayim Ladav. So what's interesting is, for our purposes, that suddenly, in the last chapter of Tractate Nazir, we have this phrase, Raglayim Ladavar. And I was actually looking last night. I couldn't find in the Mishnah of Sota the term Raglayim Ladavar. I did a very peremptory search. I didn't look carefully. It's in the Gemara. Because for the Gemara, the Sota, it's exactly this question. So this leads us to consider that actually the last chapter of Nazir is written as a kind of introduction to Tractate Sota. And the broader question here is, to what extent the Mishnah in general, I've talked about the Mishnah as a gateway to Torah Shebaal Peh. And one of the fascinating things about the Gemara is the way it brings different areas of halacha together, how it reasons from one to the other. You already see this in the Mishnah. We'll see next week, and we'll do two mishnaic next week, and we'll see that the Mishnah itself is comparing things that seem to have absolutely no connection one with the next. But the idea of reasoning from one area of law to another is central to the Mishnah. It's part of a larger project, I think, that the Mishnah is engaged in, which is the following. The Mishnah is what the Mishnah is about, whether it's strictly speaking a code or more than a code. What the Mishnah and the Talmud are actually about is the following. It starts with the Torah. When you look at the Chumash strikes us, I think, as a storybook, which from time to time has many rules. In terms of codes of rules, when you look at leaving out the book of Vayikra, of the laws of sacrifices, when you read the Chumash, basically, you have the Parasha of Mishpatim. There are a set of rules over there. You have Kedoshim in Vayikra, chapter 19. There are a set of rules. And you have in the book of Devarim a bit more extensive set of rules, Parashat Shoftim, Parashat Kitetse. But fundamentally, when you look at the Torah generally, 70% of it or more are basically stories. And even the rules and the codes that we have in the Torah are not complete codes. They have particular focus. In the book of Devarim, it's on marriage, it's on war, etc. But they are not complete. None of them are complete. And the question is that what the Mishnah is trying to do, and the Gemara follows in its footsteps, is trying to create a system of law, a system of rules, an all-encompassing system of rules. But the question is, and it's based on the Torah. But when you read the Torah, there is no full system there, far from it. So the project of the Mishnah and the Gemara in its footsteps is to build a system out of what appears to be not enough information. And it does so by virtue of drashot, it does so by virtue of kind of exegesis, it does so every so often by claiming that there are traditions that don't exist in the Torah, halacha, etc. And it does so by deriving one thing from the other. Yes, it always says it in this area of law, but we can derive from that 5 other areas of law. So that's the great project that the Mishnah is engaged in. And that's why the Mishnah is really the beginning of Torah Shebaal Peh. So here you have a good example of this, where already it's setting up the next tractate, Raglayim Ladavar. People have, there's a kind of presumptive status, what the Gemara sometimes calls chazaka. We assume things to retain their status. That's an assumption that the Mishnah is making. What we'll do next week is we will follow up with this, because it's important, not just in terms of Nazir, but in terms of the Mishnah in general. And then we will next week hopefully conclude with the last Mishnah, which takes us back to the Nazir and raises a different question about the kind of person that becomes the Nazir. The last Mishnah in Tractate Nazir, a new person suddenly emerges on the scene, not Avshalom and not Shimshon, but Shmuel. That's the last Mishnah of Tractate Nazir. Was Shmuel a Nazir? A dispute in the Mishnah. We'll have to stop at this point. Okay, so next week we will pick up with chapter 9. We saw this week, I want to talk a little bit more about Tumat Tatahom, just to put that in better perspective. A very strange rule that probably not familiar to too many people, Tumat Tatahom. And I want to talk about Tumah in general. Tractate Nazir has a lot about Tumah. I want to talk about that maybe 10 or 15 minutes next week. Some rather fascinating ideas about Tumah. We'll move to Raglayim Ladavar, and then the Shmuel, the Nazir. Now we'll complete these sessions of the mission. Okay, so we'll stop at this point, and thank you for participating. Looking forward to next week.
All right.
So wonderful.
Hope to see
David, can I ask you one question?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm doing Mishnah Yomit, and we're in Shkalim.
Yes.
And is there something that discusses how that follows from Eruvin? I mean, you've just piqued my interest.
That's a very good question. Where is Shkalim mentioned?
No, how does that follow from Eruv? You know, Eruvin was really difficult. Shkalim is much more interesting to me. And I find the idea of
I
speculation.
have to see where Shkalim
futures-
actually is. You know, something I remember there being an issue with where Shkalim is, and I don't remember off the top of my head. I'll take a look at that. They're in
Okay.
general in size order, but again, why should Shkalim be there? It is in Moed. I have to check. I have to take a look and see.
Okay.
By the way,
Thank
we at Rish are thinking about doing a Mishnah Yomi project, by the way. And if we do launch it, that will be in, sometime in the future. But we're very seriously considering this. A lot of talk now about launching our own Mishnah Yomi. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone. Bye.